Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program with diplomacy in the Korean Peninsula. There's been another about phase from the White House, which is now saying there will be no joint military exercises with South Korea. President Donald Trump also held his personal relationship with DPRK leader Kim Jong Un. The announcement this time comes less than 24 hours after Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said there were no plans yet to suspend any more major military exercises in South Korea. So, whom to believe? What will be the impact of the two very different announcements on the US-DPRK relations? Take a look at this.
U-turns and flip-flops have been the hallmarks of the Trump administration, and Wednesday was no exception. President Trump tweeted a White House statement saying the president believes that his relationship with Kim Jong Un is a very good and warm one, and there is no reason at this time to be spending large amounts of money on joint U.S.-South Korea war games. But it seems the president and his defense secretary aren't on the same page. Less than 24 hours earlier, Jim Mattis had hinted at resuming the drills with South Korea.
We took the step to suspend several of the largest exercises as a good faith measure coming out of the Singapore summit. We have no plans at this time to suspend any more exercises.
The joint military exercises between Washington and Seoul have long been a sore point for the DPRK's leadership, and the Trump administration agreed to suspend some of the exercises after the Singapore summit as U.S. diplomats advanced nuclear disarmament talks with Pyongyang. Things seem to be moving in the right direction, but now it changed. So far, follow-on negotiations between Washington and Pyongyang regarding the details of a nuclear disarmament deal have stalled. Last week, the Trump administration canceled what would have been Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's fourth trip to Pyongyang for talks. Meanwhile, U.S. officials have said the DPRK's nuclear and missile programs are still progressing clandestinely. Despite the U.S. announcement, Seoul says the scheduled inter-Korean summit will go ahead as planned. South Korea and the DPRK have agreed that their leaders will meet in Pyongyang next month, and the two Koreas held reunions last week for families separated by the Korean War. South Korea's top national security advisor said on Tuesday denuclearization is a very important and difficult issue to resolve. He also anticipates resumed negotiations between the DPRK and the United States in the near future, saying both sides have a firm willingness toward talks.
So what happens now to Korean Peninsula diplomacy with U.S. and South Korea military drills still in the cards? Well, I can't answer that question. Maybe my panelists could help me in that regard. Let's ask them. With us in our Beijing studio, Zhao Tong, who's an associate at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome, sir. In Washington, D.C., we invited Jenny Tao, a research analyst at the Stimson Center and the managing editor of 38 North, an expert on the DPRK issue. And joining us in Boston, Jim Walsh, who is with the Security Studies Program of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, Mr. Walsh, assuming that you could read the mind of your president, so joint military exercises or not joint military exercises, visit or no visit to DPRK, Mr. Walsh, please help.
Well, I'll do my best. Obviously, I cannot read the mind of the president. But I think going back to before the Singapore summit, he seemed personally invested in North Korea and North Korean diplomacy as an issue. Whether it was because of the hint of a Nobel Peace Prize or whatever, he seemed very deep, more emotionally committed than I've seen him to other issues. And so I think for him, with Mattis saying essentially saying we're going to resume military exercises, he reacted to that quickly, strongly, as is his style, and independently of talking to anyone, because he doesn't want to see the North Koreans resume nuclear and missile tests, because then the whole promise of the summit would come crumbling down. And so I think he's committed to it. He has a different point of view than his staff and advisors and his cabinet members, and those differences are playing out live on Twitter.
All right. Ms. Town, despite what is going on, the war of Twitter, let's take a look at what has been the reason of this flip-flop. Ms. Town, there are media reports suggesting, we do not know whether reliable sources are behind this though, that there's some kinds of under-the-table discussion and even some kind of apparent agreement between the United States President and also the DPRK leader about a peace declaration and about the denuclearization, a mutual process with one another. Ms. Tao, some suggesting it's because the U.S. did not follow its promise as the DPRK sees it, and that is why we're coming to this point. Ms. Tao, do you think this is believable or not?
Well, I do think it's believable. You know, it's hard to say how reliable these sources are, but, you know, certainly more happened at the Singapore summit than what was in the declaration itself, and it's never been clear as to what that is. But I think if it is true, I think we have a real credibility problem now, and I think, you know, as Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump have built this relationship, I think both sides feel they have the ability now to escalate issues to a higher level if they're unhappy with the direction that they're going, and that both leaders are supposed to respond in a way that would keep the process moving. If the president did promise something and the administration is now trying to change that and make it conditional, certainly there's reasons why North Korea would be angry with that, of moving those goalposts. But I think, you know, the question is going to be, with Kim Jong Un, you know, if you escalate to Kim Jong Un, he can overrule the bureaucracy. I think they're looking to Donald Trump now to see, can he overrule the bureaucracy if it's a decision that the administration doesn't like, but the president has said he will do.
Of course, whether they have the capabilities of overrule the process and the administration is one thing, but what is the exact purpose of that overruling definitely is probably more important than the capability itself. Having said that, though, Mr. Zhao, you know, there are several things. Joint military exercises or not joint military exercises, visited by the Secretary of State or his special representative to the DPRK or not going. And another thing is possible more sanctions or not more sanctions. All these are different layers of pressure. Obviously, the Trump administration is trying to convey to Pyongyang right now. Mr. Zhao, will they work, though?
I think we have been there, and Trump knows that. If everyone goes back to the fire and fury status of affairs, apparently that's very dangerous. Even recently, the former U.S. Special Representative for North Korean Affairs, Ambassador Joseph Yun, in an interview he said he himself was extremely nervous last year about the possibility of a military conflict. So no one wants to go back to that status. I don't think the U.S. Strategy of imposing more pressure will work. I think my theory of interpreting President Trump's strategy is President Trump knows very well that Kim Jong Un wants to go to UN in late September. He wants to take the floor of the UN General Assembly, and he wants to engage with other national leaders in New York. But in order to achieve that, he needs to make quick breakthrough with North Korea's relationship with United States. So the time is a little more on the American side. So President Trump basically is signaling to Kim that, look, I'm not in a hurry, but you are. So I can wait. I can wait even after the trade dispute between China and the United States is resolved before I talk to you again. So now the ball is back in your court. Make your decision.
Well, it could be his assumption. Whether that is the reality or not, it's another question. I'm not sure whether a leader, in order to make a speech at the General Assembly, would sacrifice what he considers as the most important interests when it comes to its security. Having said that, though, this is an interesting question, isn't it, Ms. Tao? I mean, President Trump, we know he always blames others, but this time it's too obvious when there's a, a stalemate rather between DPRK and the United States on the nuclear issue. He blames China. So convenient. So out of everything he said about China recently, particularly when there's a apparent trade war going on here. So, Ms. Tao, I have to report to you today, the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman brushed it off and say, we just cannot respond to things like this. We are not capable of responding to things like this, meaning the remarks coming from the president on Twitter. Ms. Tao, how should we understand this mentality and psychology?
I wish I could tell you.
All right,
I think I think there are a lot of things at play right here, and certainly there's a very difficult domestic situation as well. That I think on some level, the president is trying to distract from the domestic political turmoil. He's trying to distract from potentially what could be seen as a diplomatic failure, and pointing to something that he thinks is one of the strengths of his administration is being tough on China. So I think that's a little bit of what's happening here, a little kind of smoke and mirrors and diversion. But certainly it's not going to solve the problem, and it doesn't win us any friends if we are trying to, for instance, impose more sanctions or encourage, continued implementation of sanctions. It's hard to really make that case of you should be working with us when we're beating you against the head as well. So it's whatever the rationale was for doing it, it probably wasn't the most well thought out.
Well, Mr. Walsh, it is no secret that President Trump is not a person that plans. He only thinks about today, not necessarily about anything tomorrow. So, Mr. Walsh, having said that, though, what does it mean when he's taking this, get by but today as much as possible attitude and mentality to the joint ally relationship in a way, South Korea, Japan, and meanwhile the earlier partners in the six-party talks, China, Russia, at least on the issue of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. What would that mean for this apparent partnership now seem to be further on the verge of collapsing?
Well, I think we have to say that the president is reactive by nature. He himself describes himself as a counterpuncher. He often lashes out when he's angry about something and does so independently. He doesn't really coordinate with his advisors or even his allies, so I think that's sort of standard fare. As it plays out for the allies in the region, I think it plays out very differently. On the one hand, my guess is that President Moon is relieved to have heard these tweets saying that the relationship is good and that there won't be a resumption of drills, because he's in the middle of launching a rather large inter-Korean dialogue process. They've had the family reunions. He'll be meeting Kim again, for the third time now? I can't remember. So he very much has a policy of wanting to affirmatively engage. Yes, exactly, and they're probably going to talk about Kaesong. I mean, there are all sorts of things that are on the table here. And I'm guessing that President Moon was a little nervous given Secretary Mattis's comments and also the president's cancellation of the Pompeo visit. I think the tweets, as of yesterday, now give him essentially the green light to continue to go forward. I think for Japan has always, I think, in the region had the toughest stance towards North Korea. And they're probably wondering, what is tomorrow going to bring? Are we going to have another reversal of policy followed by that? So I think for the allies, it's okay. I think if you work for the Trump administration, if you're Mike Pompeo or someone else, your job is getting more difficult because you say one thing and your boss cuts you off at the knees. And so if you show up, if Pompeo shows up in Pyongyang, a month from now, the North Koreans, probably ignore him because they know it all comes down to the relationship with Donald Trump, and whatever the individual advisors or cabinet members say doesn't matter as much. So I think it's empowered President Moon, and it's disempowered the Secretary of State.
Interesting the way you say it. Mr. Zhao, I want you also to respond to the two questions asked the other two panelists earlier. One is about blaming China so conveniently, China's response as well. The other thing is the apparent collapse of this, consensus among different parties of the earlier six-party talks as a result of this flip-flopping attitude coming from the Trump administration on the denuclearization issue. Mr. Zhao.
Well, on China, in his latest tweets, President Trump basically said he knows North Korea is receiving tremendous pressure from China because of the US-China trade war. Basically, he's implying that China is pressuring North Korea to slow down on the progress of denuclearization and be less cooperative with the United States. I think that simply doesn't make sense. China, is already a country that is surrounded by nuclear weapon states like Russia, India, Pakistan, United States, and it doesn't benefit China at all to add another nuclear weapon state in the long run. And China always concerned that US and other powers might use the excuse of a nuclear-capable North Korea to present a bigger military presence in this region to threaten China. So of course China wants to see quick and immediate progress on denuclearization. So if Trump believes in that, I think he's simply delusional. And also, he might be knowing that there is a possibility that Chinese President Xi Jinping might be going to Pyongyang, as some media reports. So he might want to see how China might be able to again use this influence over North Korea to push North Korea towards denuclearization. On the allies question, I think it's certainly true that President Trump is making it more difficult for policy coordination between Washington and Seoul and Tokyo. In fact, he does not only dispower Secretary Pompeo, he also dispowered his newly appointed special representative, Mr. Steve Biegun. Right? Basically, in his recent move, he powered himself, presenting himself in the center of decision-making and making everyone else less important and more irrelevant. That's very bad for Mr. Biegun. I think looking at South Korea and Japan, apparently they don't see eye to eye either. But behind the scenes, I think there are also interesting moves from Tokyo. There is a recent report that there was a secret meeting between Japan and North Korea in Vietnam in July, and some people were working on preparing for a possible summit meeting in November between the Japanese Prime Minister and Kim Jong Un.
Right.
So I think basically two allies, they don't want to be left behind.
I see. Ms. Tao, from now on toward the end of this year, this is going to be a very busy schedule, even on the U.S. calendar. You got the midterm elections certainly, but before that, there's the UN General Assembly, as many of you have mentioned earlier. There's later going to be also G20 and APEC. During some of these occasions, if things are working toward the positive direction, certainly it could be a platform in which parties can meet and come up with further good news. But things would go the other way around as well. Ms. Tao, before the midterm election, is there going to be any hope about things getting better?
Well, it's hard to say. It's always hard to say. Everyone knows that
Ms.
there
Tao,
is the interest.
I know exactly what you're going to say, but I just want to test you with that little question, because I remember exactly, you said exactly the same thing last time I asked you on the air. So let's put away that little test question. Let me ask you a more fundamental question. Eventually, what do you think, Ms. Tao, given the changing picture of geopolitics, let's just say between China and the United States, and also in the Asia-Pacific region, what will be this issue of DPRK mean for all parties? Ms. Tao, your thoughts?
Well, certainly this is an important issue, and it's an issue that everyone except North Korea feels that North Korea's nuclear weapons are a problem. The question is, what are we willing to do to solve the problem? I think the problem now is the approach that we're taking has been a very high-profile, high-level meetings and these summits, but this isn't how you work out details. And as we've seen, the details in these meetings have been very vague and very hard to track. And so it's hard to track progress in order to really establish what these goalposts are and establish are we getting anywhere and are we getting what we want. I don't think we're going to see any substantive progress until we have an actual negotiating mechanism in place, where it's not just from meeting to meeting, but actual negotiators, such as the new Special Representative Stephen Biegun, to be able to sit down, with the North Koreans over a course of, weeks and months and really hash out the details. Because what we have now is just simply, declarations and summits and promises, some of which we know, some of which we don't know.
Right.
And again, it's very difficult then to assess how is the process going. All we're seeing is public relations, all we're seeing is tweets going back and forth, but is that really what we're supposed to see or not? And we just don't have a good clue.
Right. Ms. Tao is suggesting we're not even starting yet the real process. Mr. Walsh and Mr. Zhao, 30 seconds for both of you, very briefly. Your final thought, Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, I agree with Jenny. I think what we need is an actual negotiation. It took 3 years to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. It's going to take some time. But I don't think things are going to change. We're going to have the chaos and the news headlines, but I don't expect things to change by the end of the year, certainly not before the midterm elections, because I think the president wants to have this relationship, and that will carry it through at least through November.
Well, Mr. Walsh, you are very good at kicking the can down the road. Mr. Zhao, final words from you. Less than 30 seconds left.
I think it's justified that some people are still very suspicious about North Korean sincere in denuclearization. But we have a chance to test that, right? If North Korea wants to improve relations and may feel safe and therefore surrender the nuclear weapons later, why don't we give them the chance to prove their sincerity?
Well, as the song goes, give peace a chance. We hope it is a sign of the peace. Thank you so much, the three of you, for helping us to update what's going on and have a better insight about exactly what the realities are. Thank you. Zhao Tong, Jenny Tao, Jim Walsh. Really appreciate it.